Welcome to the podcast, Reform Thinking. Today we're taking a deep dive into the source material, unpacking an assumption that, well, almost all of us make about our own goodness.
Yeah, it's a very common human default setting, for sure.
Right. Think about how you evaluate your day when you are driving home from work, you are sitting in traffic, you are tired, and you run through this mental checklist of your behavior.
You were looking at the things you actively avoided, right?
Spot on. You tell yourself, I didn't steal office supplies. I didn't yell at the guy who cut me off on the highway. I didn't cheat on my taxes. You look at that clean ledger and you feel a sense of moral safety.
You feel decent because, like you said, we measure our righteousness by the visible, jagged lines we manage not to cross.
Yeah, it's like we think of morality as a series of guardrails.
And as long as our car doesn't smash into one of those guardrails, we consider ourselves excellent drivers. It is a very comforting way to live because it's binary. You either robbed the bank or you didn't.
But when you step into the world of systematic theology, specifically looking at the human heart through the lens of the Westminster Confession and Reformed theology, that entire baseline assumption gets obliterated.
Oh, it completely falls apart.
Yeah. The sources we are looking at today argue that judging your goodness by the bad things you haven't done is a massive theological blind spot. We are unpacking the concept of sins of omission, specifically the failure to actively love your neighbor.
It strips away all that padding we build around our daily routines. The premise of this deep dive is that harmlessness is an illusion.
Which is a tough pill to swallow. We have this idea that passive compliance, just leaving people alone and minding our own business, equals holiness.
But the text argues that God's law requires something far more aggressive and demanding than just a policy of non-interference.
So let's establish the ground rules for this. Where do we even start with defining a sin of omission? Because if we are moving beyond just don't break the rules, well, we need a clear standard.
The anchor for the source material's entire argument is James chapter 4, verse 17. The text states the premise with unnerving simplicity.
What does it say?
It says, "Therefore to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin." That single verse redefines the boundaries of human guilt.
Wow. Yeah, that really does change the framework.
It exposes a category of transgression that we naturally, almost instinctively, prefer to ignore. You can entirely refrain from theft, yet fail to relieve someone who is financially drowning.
Right. You can successfully avoid speaking slander or gossip, yet refuse to speak words of comfort or gospel truth when someone desperately needs to hear them.
So we are talking about the good that we withhold. It's a failure to act rather than an act of malice.
To give this some systematic clarity, the author's point is straight to the Westminster Shorter Catechism, right?
Yes. Specifically, question 14, which asks, what is sin? The answer provided by the 17th century divines is brilliant in its precision.
Let's unpack that answer.
They state that sin is any want of conformity unto, or transgression of, the law of God. Notice the two distinct halves of that definition.
Okay, so a transgression is stepping over a line you are strictly forbidden to cross. It is an active violation.
Right, but a want of conformity is a lack. It is a failure to meet the positive shape of the standard God has set.
That phrase, want of conformity, is the linchpin here. Let's think about why human nature heavily prefers the second half of that definition, the transgressions.
We love negative commands. Don't steal, don't kill, don't bear false witness.
We latch onto those because they allow for entirely passive compliance. You can sit in a chair alone in an empty room for 24 hours, do absolutely nothing, burn 0 calories, and successfully not murder anyone.
Yeah, and then you can congratulate yourself on your stellar moral record.
Which is why harmlessness is such a deceptive metric for our standing before God. The text argues that God's law is not a vacuum. It requires positive, active love.
Look at how Jesus summarizes the law in Matthew chapter 22. When asked about the greatest commandments, he doesn't frame man's duty in negative terms.
He doesn't say, thou shalt not bother anyone.
No, he says the second great commandment is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That requires a disposition of sincere goodwill.
It requires concrete, muscular action directed toward the physical and spiritual good of another person.
Let's use an analogy to illustrate the mechanism of this duty. It helps separate passive non-interference from actual righteousness.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine a security guard hired to watch over a bank vault. One afternoon, a group of armed thieves walks in and starts emptying the safety deposit boxes.
And what does the guard do?
The security guard just sits in his chair behind the desk. He watches the entire robbery unfold. He doesn't hold the door open for the thieves, he doesn't hand them any tools, and he doesn't pocket a single dime of the stolen money.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Later, when the police arrive and question him, his defense is, "I didn't steal anything, I broke no laws, I am completely innocent."
Any jury in the world would look at that guard and convict him on the spot. His defense is absurd.
Right, because by failing to act, by sitting there in passive silence when he had a specific mandate to protect that bank, he violated his duty.
He didn't actively commit the theft, but his harmlessness means nothing. By omitting the required action, he is entirely guilty of failing his post.
If we pull that analogy out and apply it to the broader culture, we start to see how our entire society is structured to validate the security guard's mindset.
How so?
Well, modern civil laws are built almost exclusively around the concept of non-interference. Our civic framework is designed to keep us from injuring one another, stealing from one another, or defrauding one another.
So classical liberalism conditions us to believe that as long as we respect property rights and don't physically harm anyone, we have fulfilled our highest civic duty.
Yeah, leaving people alone equates to being a good citizen.
And the fatal flaw is that we take that horizontal civic framework and we project it uttered onto God's moral law. We assume God grades on a curve of external decency.
We treat God like a cosmic civil magistrate whose only concern is that we don't disrupt the peace in his universe. But the law of God is a revelation of his own righteous character.
Because God himself is generous, patient, truthful, and merciful.
Right, and so the image bearers he commands are expected to reflect those exact same excellencies. He isn't just looking for an absence of crime. He demands the presence of his character in our actions.
That really reframes how we have to read the Ten Commandments. Even the negative ones, like thou shalt not steal, aren't just stop signs.
The old Reformed theologians, guys like Zacharias Ursinus and the authors of the Heidelberg Catechism, had a very specific hermeneutic for this.
What was their approach?
They taught that wherever God forbids a sin, he simultaneously requires the contrary virtue, and wherever he commands a duty, he forbids the neglect of it.
So the command, do not murder, isn't just a prohibition against taking life. It implies a positive, binding duty to preserve life and seek the physical well-being of your neighbor.
Yes, and the command, do not steal, implies a positive duty to protect and promote the lawful good of your neighbor's possessions.
This means neighbor love isn't some optional extra credit adornment to the Christian life for people who have the spiritual gift of mercy.
No, it is structurally embedded into the very commandments we claim to follow every single day.
So let's look at how the text of Scripture explicitly targets this passive mindset. Where do we see the Bible dismantling the idea that minding our own business is a virtue?
The source text provides some rigorous biblical exegesis to demonstrate this, starting in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 is where the command to love your neighbor as yourself originates.
I think the Hebrew word used for neighbor there is really significant, right?
It is. The word is rhea. Moses deliberately chose this word over more restrictive terms like which specifically means a blood brother or an Israelite kinsman.
So rhea is much broader.
Very much so. It refers to anyone in your proximity, anyone you encounter. The sphere of your responsibility extends to whoever God's providence places in your path on any given day.
And the word for love in that passage carries a lot of weight, too. It's not the way we use the word love today.
Not at all. The Hebrew word is ahav. In a covenantal context like Leviticus, it does not mean a fleeting emotion, a warm sentiment, or just wishing someone well in your heart.
It demands active covenantal loyalty.
Right. It is a commitment of the will, often at great personal cost, to seek the highest good of that person in your proximity.
Here is where the tension really ratchets up. Jesus takes that Old Testament concept from Leviticus and weaponizes it against the self-righteousness of the religious leaders in the first century.
The sources highlight three major parables and teachings in the New Testament that expose the specific danger of passing by. Let's look at the Good Samaritan first in Luke chapter 10.
That is the definitive text on this issue. The setup is crucial. A lawyer asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?"
But the text tells us he asked this to justify himself. He was looking for a theological loophole to narrow his responsibility.
He wanted Jesus to give him a finite list of people he had to care for so he could safely ignore everyone else.
Yeah. And Jesus responds with the story of a man traveling down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho.
And that road was notoriously dangerous. It was a steep drop in elevation, full of caves known as the Way of Blood, because bandits constantly ambushed travelers there.
So the man gets beaten, stripped, and left half dead. And then the first two travelers come along.
A priest and a Levite
Ugh.
both see the man. Both pass by on the other side of the road.
Now, we have to look at the historical context to understand the mechanism of their sin. They likely had religious justifications for their omission.
Oh, right, because of the ceremonial laws.
Exactly. Well, spot on. According to Numbers 19, touching a corpse would render them ceremonially unclean for 7 days.
So if they were heading to Jerusalem for temple service, touching this half-dead man, who might die while they were helping him, would disqualify them from their religious duties.
So they wrapped their apathy in the language of piety. They convinced themselves that maintaining their ceremonial purity was a higher duty than showing mercy to a dying man.
But the crucial detail here is the basis of their condemnation. They aren't condemned because they participated in the violence.
They didn't swing the clubs, the robbers did the beating, the priest and the Levite are condemned entirely for their distance.
They embody a religion that maintains an outward appearance of flawless orthodoxy while entirely neglecting active mercy.
They were not violent, but they were loveless. Their omission proved that their piety was hollow.
By contrast, the Samaritan, a cultural and ethnic enemy of the beaten man, draws near.
He binds the wounds, pours on oil and wine, puts the man on his own animal, pays for the lodging, and promises to return and cover any additional costs.
Jesus is showing that passing by when love requires action is a definitive transgression of God's law.
We see the exact same dynamic, maybe even more terrifyingly, in the story of the wealthy man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16.
You have a man clothed in purple and fine linen, feasting sumptuously every single day. And right at his gate is Lazarus, covered in thorns, hoping just for the crumbs that fall from the table.
Look at what the text does not say about the wealthy man's behavior.
That's the scariest part. It never says the wealthy man ordered his guards to beat Lazarus. It doesn't say he unleashed the dogs on him.
He didn't curse him or drive him away into the street. He didn't commit any aggressive act of malice against him.
He simply stepped over him, day after day.
It was a quiet, respectable sin. He lived in absolute abundance and allowed the misery at his doorstep to go entirely unaddressed.
His comfort was untouched by mercy. He didn't actively create Lazarus's poverty, but his refusal to alleviate it was his defining moral failure.
And when the text moves to the afterlife, we see that this cold-hearted disregard was enough to damn him. He possessed the ability to relieve distress, he saw the distress clearly, and he remained totally unmoved.
Which leads directly into the third major text the source material examines. The final judgment described in Matthew chapter 25.
Right, where the Son of Man separates the nations like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats.
The goats are placed on the left hand, condemned, and told to depart into everlasting fire. And the ground of their condemnation is entirely based on an absence of action.
I was hungry, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick and in prison, and you visited me not.
Notice their reaction. They are genuinely shocked by the verdict. They ask, Lord, when saw we thee hungry or athirst?
They assumed their harmlessness was a shield. They probably thought, we didn't steal your food, we didn't throw you in prison, we didn't tear your clothes.
They evaluated their lives by the negative commands. But Christ identifies their failure to minister to the least of these as a direct failure toward him. It proves that their hearts were completely untouched by saving grace.
Let's push back on this standard for a minute because it feels overwhelmingly strict. Let's go back to James 4:17.
To him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin.
The source text points out a specific detail about the Greek syntax used in that verse that provides some necessary nuance.
Yeah, the syntax prevents us from turning this into an impossible legalistic trap.
The Greek participle for knowing indicates a settled, established knowledge. And the participle for not doing is a present active participle, which points to a habitual, ongoing failure to perform the good.
Wait, so let's get practical here. Say I am running late for a flight. I am sprinting through the terminal, I see someone drop a huge bag of groceries, and I keep walking because I am panicked about missing my plane.
Okay, I see what you're asking.
Is that the kind of sin James is talking about?
Yeah, right.
Am I living in a state of apathetic rebellion because I missed that one opportunity?
That is a vital distinction to make. Now, from a strictly theological standpoint, any failure to love perfectly is a falling short of God's glory.
Sure.
But James is targeting something much deeper than a momentary lapse in judgment. He is addressing a settled disposition of the heart.
So he is talking to the person who consistently, habitually, looks at the needs of others and chooses self-preservation or comfort as a lifestyle.
Right. It's not about a panicked moment at the airport. It's about a life architecture built on ignoring the neighbor. It is a systematic, daily refusal to engage with the suffering or needs of those God has placed in your proximity.
So this habitual apathy isn't just a horizontal social failing. We aren't just talking about being a rude neighbor or a bad citizen.
No, the theology runs much deeper. This brings us to the vertical dimension of the offense. The authors argue forcefully that failing to love a neighbor is first and foremost a sin against God himself.
It is an act of moral insubordination against the Creator.
We constantly reduce neighbor love to a horizontal issue. We think of it as a matter of courtesy, philanthropy, or civic decency.
But Scripture elevates it to a divine command.
When a person refuses to show mercy, they are not simply letting down another human being. They are actively rebelling against the sovereign who issued the decree.
The severity of the sin is measured by the infinite authority of the God it defies.
And it is also measured by the dignity of the person we are ignoring. The sources dig into the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God.
From Genesis chapter 1 onward, Scripture teaches that human beings possess a unique, inherent worth because they are made in the likeness of their Creator.
They reflect his rational, moral, and relational attributes. When you neglect a neighbor, you are disregarding the imago Dei in that person.
To ignore someone's suffering is to treat an image bearer of God as a disposable inconvenience.
James actually points out this exact contradiction in his epistle. He says we use our tongues to bless God, and then we turn around and curse men who are made in the similitude of God.
The exact same logic applies to neglect. You cannot claim to have deep reverence for God while displaying contemptuous indifference toward his image bearers. It is a theological impossibility.
This raises a fascinating diagnostic question about the human heart. If we are habitually omitting love, what does that actually reveal about what is operating beneath the surface?
The sources argue it reveals a staggering amount of idolatry.
Outward dramatic sins like explosive anger or adultery expose erupting passions. But sins of omission uncover the silent, calculating idolatry that lives beneath the surface of our highly respectable behavior.
A person may maintain a flawless public image, perfectly well-mannered, while inwardly worshiping ease, comfort, convenience, and self-protection.
We don't help because helping costs time, and our schedule is our idol.
We don't give because giving diminishes our own financial reserves, and our bank account is our security idol.
We enthrone the self where love should reign. Pride, unbelief, coldness, and the fear of man all converge in this sin of omission.
It proves how thoroughly sin has penetrated human nature, because it is the fruit of a heart curved completely inward upon itself, seeking only its own preservation.
If you're listening to this right now, you're probably feeling totally crushed. Let's be honest.
Yeah, if every person on the street is an image bearer, and if withholding active love is an act of moral insubordination against God, am I sinning every single time I walk past a homeless encampment without emptying my wallet?
That is the pastoral tension we have to navigate with tremendous care.
I mean, am I sinning when I silence my phone because I just need an hour of peace, knowing someone might need me? How do we manage this standard without falling into absolute paralyzing despair?
We must differentiate between human circumstantial limitations and a cold, detached heart. God created you as a finite creature.
You are bounded by space, time, physical energy, and financial resources.
You literally cannot fix every problem, feed every hungry person, or relieve every affliction on the planet. God does not demand omniscience or omnipotence from you.
So finitude is not a sin. The limitation of our capacity isn't the failure.
Right. The sin occurs when we weaponize those very real limitations as an excuse.
Or when we use modern therapeutic language like, I'm just setting healthy boundaries, as a polished, acceptable excuse for raw selfishness.
The question at the end of the day is not whether you solved every problem you saw. The question is, what is the genuine disposition of your heart toward the specific neighbors God has placed in your immediate path?
When providence presents a clear, unavoidable opportunity for mercy, and you actually possess the means to act, do you move toward the need?
Or do you harden your heart, cite a technicality, and walk away to protect your comfort?
That forces us to look at the mechanism of our inaction. Are we genuinely incapable of helping in that moment, or are we just unwilling to be inconvenienced?
Having established just how pervasive this sin is and how impossible it is to justify ourselves through passive harmlessness, we need to examine how different theological camps attempt to handle this guilt.
The source material takes some very clear polemical stances here. It contrasts Reformed theology with several other frameworks to show how unique the Reformed view of human ability really is.
Let's start with how it addresses Arminianism.
The text relies on the Reformed doctrine of total depravity to critique Arminianism.
The Reformed view argues that fallen humanity is completely dead in sin. We do not possess the natural inherent free will to initiate or fulfill this radical, self-denying kind of neighbor love apart from sovereign, regenerating grace.
The human will is naturally in bondage to self-love.
Arminianism, according to the author's critique, suggests that man retains enough natural ability to choose to cooperate with God and produce this good on his own.
The Reformed counterargument is that if the standard of love is this absolute, relying on any native human ability is a recipe for either arrogance or despair. We need a new heart, not just a pep talk.
The text also draws a sharp contrast with Roman Catholicism, specifically regarding how omissions are categorized in their moral theology.
Yeah, the source notes that Roman Catholic moral theology often categorizes certain omissions as venial sins.
These are considered lesser offenses that might damage our relationship with God, but do not destroy justifying grace or warrant eternal damnation.
The Reformed perspective, drawing heavily on the Westminster Confession, entirely rejects the mortal venial distinction in that sense.
It asserts that every sin, whether an active commission or a quiet omission, deserves God's wrath and curse because it is a violation of his infinite perfect law. There is no such thing as a minor failure to love an infinite God.
Now, moving into the modern era, the source material specifically critiques modern liberalism, the social gospel, and critical race theory.
Let's look at how the authors deconstruct these movements.
Now, to be clear to the listener, we are impartially reporting the arguments found in the source text here. We aren't taking sides on these political or social frameworks, just conveying the ideas the original authors present.
Right. They argue that these secular and progressive frameworks essentially hijack the biblical language of neighbor love.
The mechanism of their critique is fascinating. They argue that these movements take the vocabulary of Christian love and detach it from Christian theology.
They turn the command to love into a form of legalistic political activism.
Instead of offering genuine gospel peace through the forgiveness of sins, the source claims these movements base their actions on analyzing shifting power dynamics, dismantling external societal structures, and pursuing utopian social projects.
So they argue the world defines loving your neighbor as political advocacy, whereas the biblical standard requires sacrificing your own life for the spiritual and physical well-being of the neighbor, beginning with the proclamation of absolute biblical truth.
Let's dig deeper into the critique of the social gospel movement, which originated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
The concern raised by the authors is that the social gospel shifts the focus of the church away from substitutionary atonement and individual regeneration and places it almost entirely on structural reform and physical relief.
It offers physical help while neglecting the eternal state of the human soul. Think about the theological failure of that approach like this.
Let's hear the analogy.
Imagine a doctor working in an urgent care clinic. A patient comes in with a scraped knee, but the doctor, looking at the chart, also realizes this patient has a terminal, aggressively spreading disease that will kill them in 6 months if untreated.
Okay, a grim scenario.
If the doctor cleans the scraped knee, puts a nice bandage on it, gives the patient a lollipop, and sends them out the door without ever mentioning the terminal illness, is that doctor actually showing love to the patient?
No, that is medical malpractice. It is negligent.
Right. And the source's argument is that providing physical bread, fighting for better wages, or pushing for social reform without providing the truth of the gospel is an incomplete and, in the end, an unloving form of care.
It is treating the scraped knee while completely ignoring the terminal disease of sin. True neighbor love must encompass both the physical reality and the spiritual reality because humans are both body and soul.
The text also aims a critique at the opposite end of the spectrum, the prosperity gospel.
How does the prosperity gospel fail the test of neighbor love?
By turning the neighbor into a transaction.
The prosperity gospel teaches a form of pragmatic mysticism where you give money or do good deeds with the explicit expectation of receiving a multiplied financial or material return from God.
It completely corrupts the motive. You aren't sacrificing for the good of the neighbor. You are using the neighbor's need as a slot machine to get a blessing for yourself. It is self-love masquerading as charity.
Let's bring all these broad theological frameworks down to the ground level. How do these sins manifest in our actual everyday behavior?
The source material outlines the contemporary forms of loveless omission, and they are strikingly, painfully ordinary.
They are the sins we commit in our living rooms and at the office. The text lists several disguises that omission wears in the modern era.
It mentions material, relational, verbal, familial, ecclesiastical, and digital.
Let's unpack familial and relational omission first, because this is where the absence of harm is most frequently mistaken for the presence of love.
Picture a husband and father. He works a steady job. He provides financially. He never raises his voice in anger, and he is never physically violent. By every sociological standard, he is a good guy.
But he comes home, sits in his recliner, and completely withdraws emotionally. He offers cold silence.
He doesn't ask his wife about her burdens. He fails to provide spiritual leadership or tender affection. He is physically present, but relationally a ghost.
He commits no act of aggression, but his omission starves the marriage. The same applies to parenting.
You have parents who avoid all scandalous forms of abuse, but they completely neglect the steady, exhausting daily work of instructing their children, disciplining them in love, and praying with them.
The text argues that the most painful wounds in a home are often not explosive acts of rage, but established patterns of absence, emotional withdrawal, and silent neglect.
Then there's verbal omission. We live in an age of endless communication, texting, emailing, talking. Yet we frequently fail to speak when love actually requires it.
We withhold encouragement from someone who is clearly discouraged because we are too busy. We withhold correction from a close friend who is wandering into destructive behavior.
We withhold the gospel from an unbelieving coworker. And let's look at the mechanism behind that silence. Why do we stay quiet?
The text nails the diagnosis on this one. We remain silent to avoid awkwardness. It is vastly easier to say nothing than to risk relational friction.
We convince ourselves we are being polite or keeping the peace, when in reality we are just withholding truth out of pure cowardice and self-preservation.
The source also addresses ecclesiastical omission within the walls of the church. This one is particularly convicting for the Reformed tradition.
You can have a congregation that is doctrinally precise, perfectly orderly in its liturgy, and highly conservative in its morals, yet completely marked by omission.
You can sit in a pew, pass a theological exam on the Westminster Confession, sing the hymns beautifully, and simultaneously ignore the weeping widow sitting 3 rows behind you.
You don't create burdens for anyone of the church, but you don't lift a finger to bear anyone's burdens either. It is a doctrinally sound freezer.
The final category the text highlights is digital omission. This is brilliant because it addresses how we interact with information today.
Technology allows us to appear well-informed and highly connected while remaining detached from actual human need.
We've developed highly refined ways of evading the second great commandment while maintaining the illusion that we are champions of it.
I think of it as a digital anesthetic. You scroll through your social media feed and you see a tragic news story, a natural disaster, or a post about a family whose house burned down.
You click like, or you type praying, or you share the post to your own timeline with a sad face emoji.
When you do that, your brain gets a literal dopamine hit of righteousness.
You feel a psychological sense of accomplishment.
You feel like you just played the role of the Good Samaritan. You have publicly signaled your compassion to your followers, but what is the reality?
You haven't offered a single physical bandage. You haven't sacrificed a dime of your actual money. You haven't given up 5 minutes of your time to drive over and help the person.
Digital media mimics compassion without requiring an ounce of actual sacrifice. It anesthetizes our conscience, making us feel moral while we do absolutely nothing.
If a listener has stayed with us this far, the weight of the law has likely done its job.
If harmlessness is dead, if doing no harm is not enough, and if every convenient silence and ignored need is a sin of moral insubordination, how do we survive this?
How does Reformed theology offer a way out of this crushing, impossible weight?
This is where we have to pivot to the law-gospel distinction, which is the engine of Reformed theology. Everything we have been discussing up to this second is what theologians call the first use of the law.
The law acts as a mirror. Its purpose is to expose our sin, shatter our self-righteousness, and silence every clever excuse we have manufactured. It proves our total, devastating inability to save ourselves.
It leaves us with no defense. But the text does not leave the sinner bleeding out in the ditch of despair. It pivots immediately to the gospel remedy.
Justification and the active obedience of Jesus Christ.
Let's unpack the active obedience of Christ because the sources frame him as the ultimate staggering contrast to our apathy. He is the true Good Samaritan.
When we look at the incarnation and the earthly life of Jesus, we don't just see a man who successfully avoided sinning. We don't just see a man who sat in a room and didn't break the rules.
We see a man who perfectly, actively fulfilled every positive command of God's law. Where we have failed to love our neighbor as ourselves, he loved perfectly. Where we withhold mercy, he overflowed with it.
Think about the gospel narratives. When the crowds were hungry, he didn't tell them to figure it out and go buy their own food. He had compassion on them and fed the 5,000.
When his friends Mary and Martha were grieving the death of Lazarus, he didn't offer a distant stoic platitude. He stood at the tomb and wept with them.
When the lepers approached him, people, the priests and Levites, wouldn't dare touch. He reached out and touched the unclean. He never once treated a human being as an interruption to his personal schedule or comfort.
This brings us to a critical, gorgeous distinction in Reformed federal theology. When we talk about how we are justified, how we are made right with God, we often focus heavily on Christ's passive obedience.
Meaning, his suffering and dying on the cross to pay the penalty for our sins. He bore the wrath of God for our active transgressions and our cold silences.
But if he only wiped the slate clean, we would just be innocent, not righteous. We are justified by his active obedience as well.
By active obedience, we mean his perfect life of neighbor love, the years he spent fulfilling the law.
Precisely that. Remember the covenant of works in the Garden of Eden. Adam didn't just have to avoid eating the fruit. He had a positive duty to guard the garden and obey God.
He failed. Christ comes as the second Adam. His entire earthly life of joyful, continuous, positive obedience to the law of God is imputed or credited to the believer.
He bore the guilt of our respectable omissions on the cross, and in exchange, he gives us the credit for his perfect record of love.
When God looks at the believer, he does not see our habitual apathy. He sees the perfect, active compassion of Jesus Christ.
Okay, let me push on that doctrine because human nature will immediately try to find a loophole here.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
If Christ already fulfilled the law perfectly on my behalf, and his pristine record of neighbor love is permanently credited to my account, why do I need to worry about doing it now? Doesn't that mean I can just relax?
Right. The thought process is, my omissions are covered, his love is mine, so I can go back to minding my own business and enjoying my imputed righteousness.
That is the classic accusation of antinomianism, the idea that grace eliminates the need for the law, but it fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism of salvation.
That question leads us directly into what the Reformers called the third use of the law and the ongoing process of sanctification. The logic of the gospel is not that we are saved so we can remain safely apathetic.
We are saved, regenerated, and united to Christ, so that the life of Christ begins to actually flow through us. We don't act to earn salvation. We act from a place of already being completely saved.
The pressure is off, but the engine is turned on. Under the covenant of grace, the law is no longer a crushing, terrifying burden that condemns us to hell. It changes functions.
It becomes a friendly guide for grateful obedience. Because Christ has loved us with a radical, covenantal love when we were his enemies, we are now free to begin loving others.
And specifically empowered by the indwelling Holy Spirit to do so, we begin to reflect the family resemblance.
So the very same grace that pardons our lovelessness also trains our hearts in new obedience. But the source material stresses that moving forward requires specific, searching repentance. Vague, blanket confessions are totally insufficient.
Human nature loves a vague confession because it's safe. We like to pray, Lord, I am not perfect. Forgive my many shortcomings.
It sounds humble, but it keeps the conscience heavily insulated. You aren't actually dealing with a root issue. The text calls for believers to identify precise, specific areas of neglect.
It's like a doctor who sees a patient in obvious, agonizing pain, but because it's 5 in the evening on a Friday and he wants to go home, he just refuses to order the x-ray.
He doesn't break the patient's bone, but he actively chooses to stay blind to the fracture, so you won't have to do the hard work of setting it.
If we want genuine spiritual renewal, we have to stop refusing the x-ray. We have to be willing to look at the exact location of the fracture.
You have to get brutally honest. You have to admit, I neglected my wife's emotional needs this week to protect my own peace and quiet.
Or, I saw my coworker struggling with a massive workload, and I actively chose to look away and leave the office early because I didn't want to spend the energy to help.
You have to name the specific silence for what it is. Only then can you bring it to the cross.
The sources also discuss how this concept of active love in union with Christ applies to the life of the church, specifically regarding the sacraments, like the Lord's Supper.
The Lord's Supper is described in Reformed theology as the visible word. At the communion table, Christ's sacrificial love for his neighbors, meaning the church, his people, is tangibly, physically displayed.
The broken bread and the poured out cup signify the ultimate fulfillment of the active neighbor love we failed to provide. Feasting on that reality spiritually nourishes the soul.
It gives the believer the strength to go back out into the world on Monday morning and practice mercy.
It grounds our future actions not in our own white-knuckled willpower, but in the finished work and the ongoing life of the Savior. We love because he first loved us.
If we synthesize all of this and connect it back to your daily life as a listener, the call here is a radical paradigm shift. It is a call to move from the quiet, respectable sin of omission to a life of proactive, Christ-exalting love.
It means walking into your home, your workplace, and your church, and asking a terrifying but beautiful question. Whom have I neglected, and what does love require of me right now?
We have covered a massive theological landscape today. We have moved from a baseline of just doing no harm and hoping that is enough for God to a standard of active, Christ-empowered love that seeks the highest physical and spiritual good of the people God places in our path.
And we have seen that union with Christ is the only mechanism capable of producing this kind of self-denial.
Without that vital spiritual union, any attempt to love our neighbor simply devolves into either exhausting legalistic pride or crushing despair.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
What if the most accurate measure of your spiritual health isn't found in the visible, jagged transgressions you confess, but in the quiet, convenient silences you justify every single day?
That is the diagnostic question that forces us to look to Christ.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the theology of omission. We will see you next time.